Mr Dobson, if you could kindly introduce yourselves for the record, and if you'd like to say a few words up front, please, now's the time to do so. Mr Dobson, thank you.
Thank you very much, Chair. My name is Aidan Dobson and I'm Executive Director for Professional Services at the Royal Institute of British Architects, where broadly I look after educational and practice standards, but I also support the work of the RIBA's Expert Advisory Group on Fire Safety.
Wrack, please.
I'm Matt Wrack. I'm the General Secretary of the Fire Brigades Union, representing the vast majority of serving fire officers across the UK. Myself, having started as a firefighter in the London Fire Brigade in 1983 and serving as General Secretary since 2005. Our approach to the bill is we broadly support the bill. However, we have some concerns about the need for a more joined-up approach to the whole question of the fire safety regime. I, in this regard, represent particularly fire inspecting officers, a specialist group within the Fire Rescue Service, and I thank them for their feedback on their views on the bill. And I think that those concerns come down to issues about implementation and therefore about investments. Because if we take the impact assessment, for example, that impact assessment, in our view, is based on a very rough and ready calculation based on the current regime. But in our view, and the view of our members, the current regime is not fit for purpose, and that's demonstrated very clearly by some of the major failings, most notably the Grenfell Tower fire. So if we look, for example, at the specialist roles within the Fire and Rescue Service, since between 2011 and 2020, we have seen a 19% reduction in the number of watch managers, a 23% reduction in the number of station managers, a 20% reduction in the number of fire and rescue service staff overall. If we take particularly the number of inspectors, we see that inadequate record keeping by the relevant departments, currently the Home Office. Most recently, they've reported that in England there are some 951 staff eligible to carry out fire safety audits. If we look back 20 years for England and Wales, the figure was some 1,724. So we see that in terms of competent staff with rather technical expertise, we have seen very, very significant reductions. So the impact assessment that's been produced in relation to the bill, in our view, doesn't adequately take account of the demands which will be placed upon the Fire and Rescue Service as a result of the bill. And I think just finally that therefore we urge the government and parliamentarians to seek a more joined up approach to the whole question of the fire safety regime across, in this case, across England.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr Wrack. You'll be asked now some questions from a number of members of Parliament. I'm going to start with the leader on this issue for Her Majesty's Loyal Opposition, Sarah Jones.
Thank you. Mr Dobson first. In my former brief as the Shadow Housing Minister, worked a lot with RIBA in terms of excellent work that you've done looking at all of these issues post Grenfell. Could you set out, whether there's anything in the bill and the amendments that we've put forward that you would disagree with? And what you think kind of good would look like in taking this bill and whatever else needs to be done to create a fire safety system that works. And Mr Wrack, you've set out already for us quite a lot of the concerns about funding, and we know that the fire service has had significant cuts over the last 10 years. Can you again tell us what good looks like in terms of how we implement this bill? What do we need in terms of resourcing, and what do we need in terms of that joined up approach that you talked about?
Thank you. Mr Dobson, first.
Yes, I mean certainly. I think we certainly recognise that this bill is important legislation. I think I'd pick up on the point that Mr Wrack made, which is the joined up thinking. So it's, this is a piece in the jigsaw, and we're still concerned about having strong and clear functioning building regulations and a proper enforcement regime, because obviously our main expertise is in the design and construction of buildings to the point in which they're handed over to the owner or occupier, or where there's major refurbishment. So essentially, I think our concern would be the relationship between this bill and the building safety bill, because obviously the two need to join up together. I think we would support most of the provisions in the bill, particularly giving enforcement powers to local fire services in relation to the structure and external walls of buildings, fire doors, etc. Although I note Mr. Wrack's point about there needs to be the resources to do that. In terms of the joining together of the building safety bill and the upcoming fire safety bill, I suppose to highlight a danger where the gaps might exist. For example, the fire safety order talks about a responsible person. The building safety bill talks about an accountable person and a building safety manager. And, what will be the lines of communication between those people? Are they the same person? There's obviously a risk there. I think Dame Judith Hackett, who has really been the prime driver of the building safety bill content, has talked a lot about what she calls the golden thread. And I think one thing we're aware of is that the quality of information that's handed over at the end of construction work is often very poor. So if the fire service is looking at evacuation plans, wants to go, exactly what materials have been used in the building, this information obviously isn't always readily available as it should be. And I think we did table an amendment actually to suggest that the fire service and the occupier should be entitled to accurate as-built information. I think members of the committee are probably aware of some of the dangers in procurement when materials get changed during the design and construction process. Probably and I think just the point that really, whilst we welcome this bill, we still are waiting for an improved enforcement regime in relation to building regulations and changes to the approved documents. And to illustrate the importance of that, for example, within this bill, it talks about the need to review evacuation plans, but we know that some of the legislation around escape routes, etc., is very ambiguous. So we need to make sure the two tie together would be my main point.
Thank you, Mr. Dobson. Mr. Wrack, please.
Yes, thank you. I think a very good question in terms of what good would look like. I think obviously I'm approaching this from the point of view of firefighters and the fire and rescue service. There, again, in terms of the joined up approach for us, there needs to be a joined up approach between the specialist fire safety teams and firefighters on stations. So again, if you look at the question of resources, and unfortunately lots of this does come down to resources, there needs to be a greater understanding of fire safety within the operational workforce. And unfortunately, what we've seen over the past 15 or 20 years is, for example, a reduction in initial training courses as a mechanism to cut costs. So courses that might have been 16 weeks 20 years ago are now reduced to 13, 12 or less than 10 weeks in some cases. So there needs to be a greater understanding at station level of fire safety risks. There needs to be an end to the reduction in fire safety teams. I think, unfortunately, if fire services are financially squeezed, some of them have found it easier to cut specialist fire safety teams than to cut fire stations. I'm not in favour of cutting either, but they have cut fire safety teams. So we have reports of fire safety teams being cut by 25%, 50%, or more than 50% over the past decade. There needs to be a joined up approach between the two wings of the fire service in that respect, because we need to obviously prevent fires from happening if we can. We need to mitigate the spread of fire where it does occur, and also we need to know how to fight fires when they do occur, and they will occur, and they do occur, as we know. So that's what we mean by a joined up. I think there are concerns among fire safety specialist officers about the levels of training, both at station and among their own peers. There are concerns about refresher training. So if new materials come onto the market, cladding and so on, there needs to be adequate resources supplied to enable people to be updated with the latest developments. And I think the final point I'd make about what it looks like, we need a much more joined up approach nationally to the whole question of fire and fire policy and how we deal with fires. That means proper research. It is alarming that actually many firefighters and many fire services apparently didn't know what was being put onto buildings. They therefore hadn't researched how you would inspect such buildings to even be aware of the risks, for example, at Grenfell. And also, therefore, how we're not aware of how such fires might be tackled if necessary. We used to have a body in the British Fire Service called the Central Fire Brigades Advisory Council. This would have addressed such matters. Sadly, it was abolished in 2004, and nothing similar has been put in place to replace it. That's what we mean by a lack of a joined-up approach, and that is what is desperately missing in the fire safety regime in Britain today.
Thank you very much, Mr. Wrack. Daisy Cooper, followed by Andy Slaughter.
Thank you. A question to Mr. Wrack, a quick question. In your written evidence, you said that the impact assessment does not include any additional enforcement costs, and you've suggested that fire inspectors would need to spend a great deal of time and effort to focus on getting cases through the courts and things. I suspect this question might be how long is a piece of string, but in the absence of an impact assessment, are you in a position to give an estimate of your own assessment of what those additional enforcement costs might be?
Mr. Wrack?
I'm afraid I'm not able to give that. I do think that actually there have been on the question of enforcement, there has been actually in cases of ministerial pressure to reduce the enforcement role of the Fire and Rescue Service. So I think that's something that ministers need to think carefully about. And then fire services have been criticised subsequently for being slow to act on enforcement, on their enforcement role. But I think the whole question of their enforcement role ties in with the more general point I've made, is that they need adequate specialist fire safety teams, and that is what possibly certainly one of the largest areas where we've seen reductions in staffing levels, with all the knock-on concerns, as I say, about training and refresher training. So I'm not able to answer that question directly, but I think it's very much a resource question.
Thank you.
Daisy, any more?
No.
Andy Slaughter.
Good afternoon to you both. We've heard that this bill is a clarifying bill rather than introducing new powers. Do you agree with that? Do you agree that that's its purpose, and do you think it achieves that? And the specific point I'd like you both to address is, it does appear, as there's a specific mention in Clause 1 of external walls, this is directed at what we've already seen coming out of the Grenfell inquiry in relation to external cladding and cladding systems. But there are a lot more issues that have emerged from that. Issues around the way buildings are constructed or modified, around means of escape, alarm systems, processes for evacuation in that way. Do you think that is also adequately covered in this bill, or do we need other legislation? And do you think we have the means to carry all those masses out?
Thank you. Mr. Dobson first.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, quite a range of questions there, really. Yes, I mean, essentially, this is just, in my view, really just clarifying and, probably pointing to some key factors. It isn't changing fundamentally the nature of the approach. I couldn't agree more that, whilst it's useful that it highlights the issue of external wall construction and cladding, there are lots of other known issues in relation to fire safety. For example, the Scottish School Report talks a lot about fire compartmentation and lack of proper fire barriers. You pointed out the issue around means of escape and evacuation strategies. So I think it's really to return to the point I made earlier, that you can only see this as a part of the jigsaw, that really what we desperately need is clarification of the building regulations themselves and a stronger enforcement stroke competency regime around that, so that the two work together, in my view.
Thank you. Mr. Wrack.
Yeah, I see the bill as a clarifying bill, as has been suggested, and on that level we welcome it. I think with some of the amendments in particular, I think you highlight an important point, that much of the national focus is on cladding, and clearly there is a national scandal about flammable cladding being put onto buildings, but we are aware from both Grenfell and from other fires that there are many other failings in fire safety in buildings, and in particular about the risk of the breakdown of compartmentation, and that cladding is clearly one mechanism by which that's happened at Grenfell, but issues around other materials used in renovations and modifications of buildings are of course relevant. If people have fire resisting walls and then drill holes through them, that will clearly alter the fire resistance of the compartments, and all those things need to be built into a proper fire safety regime. I think on the question of evacuation, again, I don't think the bill addresses that point. It is a huge issue of concern, obviously, to people living particularly in high-rise residential buildings. It's also a huge issue of concern to firefighters who've been trained for decades in particular ways of fighting fires in high-rise residential buildings, which are based on the construction of those buildings and how they were designed. And obviously what's happened over the past 20 years or so is that those buildings have been modified in a way which was never intended, and have altered the whole structure and fire behaviour in those buildings. There is no simple answer to the question of evacuation in our view. We raised the question of a review of evacuation immediately at the close of stage 1 of the Grenfell Tower inquiry. We now have government bodies looking at reviewing evacuation policy and saying that it might take 2 or 3 years. And yet apparently people were supposed to decide on the night new strategies, when people reviewing it are telling us it will take them 2 years or more to reach such conclusions. Again, I come back to my point about joined up approach. We should have bodies in the British Fire Service which should take account of the views of all professionals, take account of research, and develop answers to these as we're going along. We should be horizon scanning, is what we should be doing. There have been fires in clad buildings elsewhere in the world. It's staggering that no one in leadership positions in the British Fire Service or at government level was monitoring those and seeing what should happen to alter policy in Britain.
Thank you, Mr. Wrack. Follow up from Mr. Sauter?
Yes, briefly. I think we understand from what you said that there is a lot to do here and that there are limited resources at the moment. Where work is going on, do you think the best practice is being followed? And is that being done both in terms of maintenance and also construction of buildings? Are you finding, we had the story in the press last week about Berkeley Homes rowing back on whether all types of cladding, including I think ACM cladding, should be removed from buildings. Do you think that this is being taken seriously and when buildings are being given planning permission, being constructed or being modified now, that the best practice and best standards are being adhered to?
Mr. Dobson.
I think I would answer broadly yes in those aspects that have now effectively been covered by prescriptive regulation. So in relation to combustible external wall materials on higher rise residential buildings, we have at the moment a fairly prescriptive piece of legislation that makes best practice pretty clear. But as you say, you can already see a certain element of lobbying going on to say that we need a more flexible approach again. So you can already see attempts to row back from that. But I think in terms of what has actually been regulated, then fairly good practice is in place. But I think, we probably know that there's quite a lot of good retrofitting work going on buildings above 18 metres, because even if it's very slow, but I don't think we really have got much idea in terms of combustible materials below 18 metres at the moment.
Mr. Wrack, did you want to comment on best practice from what you see?
I'll make a comment on the lobbying that was mentioned in terms of the comment by a building developer recently. I think one of and some earlier comments in your session, one of the voices which we are keen to see heard or to hear is those of tenants. I think the lesson of Grenfell is that the voices of tenants were ignored, and the voices of tenants are often ignored in relation to building, in relation to modification, iteration of modification of the places where they live. The vast majority of tenants are respectable, sensible people, and their views should be heard. They were not at Grenfell. And I think that they and us and firefighters would have greater respect for a risk-based approach if they could have the confidence in such a risk-based approach. Unfortunately, I think the experience shows that there is all too much risk-based approach is often driven by commercial and financial interests, and that's why people have scepticism about it.
Thank you, Mr. Wrack. Final question from Sarah Jones.
Okay, Mr. Wrack, if you could just kind of give us your view on the current system of fire risk assessors and how that needs to be changed. Obviously, there's amendments in the bill from Labour and the Lib Dems about having a more kind of qualified regime. It would be good to hear your thoughts on that. And then, Mr. Dobson, it would be helpful to just sort of get your sense, which we've sort of touched on, but this issue of the fact that there is so much to be done. So the point about the G15 having to, just the G15 having to spend £6.8 billion, the time all this is going to take. How do we prioritise? How do we fund this? And sort of, what does that process look like going forward?
Yes, Mr. Wrack, please.
Yes, thank you. Yes, we oppose a deregulated system of fire risk assessors. Sadly, much of the work that we end up doing arises out of tragedies. So one of our experiences in this regard relates to the death of one of our own members, where it emerged that the fire risk assessor in the case concerned had little or no qualifications in that field and had simply set up in business as a fire risk assessor. That highlighted to us a disgraceful state of affairs. So we would support a better regulation of fire risk assessors. However, I think that the best protection that we have in terms of the best delivery of advice to occupiers and building owners, the best mechanism for enforcement, for inspection and enforcement, is through a well-resourced and highly skilled workforce in a publicly accountable fire and rescue service.
Thank you, Mr. Wrack. Mr. Dobson.
I think what I would say is that, clearly, when it comes specifically to the issue of cladding and insulation, clearly retrofitting is possible. These materials, the very reason they were used is because they are lightweight, they are an external cladding, they don't form part of the structure of the building. So the practicality of making these buildings safer is definitely there. And we've seen some, albeit slow progress. As I think one of the witnesses in your earlier session stated, that the costs can be very significant indeed. And I think whilst in the social housing sector, steady progress is being made, I think your committee's already today discussed some of the issues when it comes to private leaseholders in privately owned blocks, and the ultimate issue of where the funding is going to come from, which of course is what set off secondary problems within the insurance market and within the mortgage market. One of the problems we face is actually professional indemnity insurance as well. So although this cladding can be identified through testing, etc., it tends to require intrusive testing. It requires specialists to look at it. That requires insurance for them as well. So there's a potential blockage there, I think. I think perhaps the bigger concern is that following the fires we had in Barking and Bolton, attention has naturally turned to whether these sorts of materials also pose a very significant risk on lower rise buildings. And there's been discussion about, what height threshold might apply there. Some people have suggested 11 metres. and indeed 11 metres is the height that's been chosen by the government for sprinklers. And I think one of the problems there is that you've got a whole different order of magnitude potentially of properties that could be affected. And that may also be a factor that's driving some of the movement in the insurance sector, because there's probably a realisation that this is potentially a much larger problem than it was perhaps first thought.
Thank you, Mr Dobson, and thank you, Mr Wrack. There are no more... Oh, I beg your pardon, there's one absolutely excellent question from Sarah Jones.
I'm going to take us to time because I've got lots of questions. Questions for Mr Wrack. Do you think we understand the scale of the problem that we're facing? I mean, just looking at the figures that came out this week on fire doors and the extraordinarily high proportion, I can't remember what it was, something like 65% of fire doors that had been inspected were wrong in some way or other. Do you think we even know yet quite what we're dealing with in terms of the scale of this problem? And then, Mr Dobson, do you agree with Mr Wrack's kind of frustration about the time it's taken to do all of this? Obviously, we're 3 years after Grenfell. And what should we be doing? Clearly there's huge complexity, and there's a lot of, there's hundreds of working groups in MHCLG working through all of this, but equally there's a real hunger for going faster. Is there any way you think, we could and should be going faster?
Thank you. Mr Wrack first, I think.
Thank you for the question. No, I don't think we have grasped the scale of the problem at all. If I can just refer back to Grenfell, obviously the focus of the country has been on the ACM cladding, but what we found at Grenfell is that virtually every single element of fire protection within the building failed. So if that's happened in one building, what is the scale in every building across the country? It is immense. And there's been a lot of renovation, refurbishment, modification of buildings over the past 20 or 30 years, which will have altered the building as it was originally designed and constructed, and will have therefore altered the fire behaviour in such a building, particularly compartmentation in terms of the response of firefighters. So, and it brings me back to, if you like, our frustration with the impact assessment that relates to the bill, because it is based on the current way in which buildings are being looked at. Our view is we need a much better way of looking at buildings. That would require time. It would require the time of specialist fire. It would require an upskilling of firefighters in fire stations to recognise risks, to then be able to refer them to specialist teams within the fire service. But that also requires training for both groups of staff. And it also requires adequate time to undertake the necessary inspections on the scale, as I say, which we don't currently grasp in full detail.
Thank you. Mr Dobson, and we have to finish this session at 1 o'clock, so you've got 2 minutes for your answer.
I'll try and rise to that challenge. I think we see the problems here as threefold. That there's an issue around how we procure buildings in the first place and procure alterations to buildings. And I imagine that when the final report of the Grenfell Tower inquiry is written, it will have much to say about that. Then there is an issue of competence and expertise, which I think you've already touched upon. And of course, the UK construction industry, is a relatively deregulated industry. There are very few regulatory competence requirements. They're mainly voluntary systems. So really the industry is going to have to put its house in order if it's going to regain public confidence. But there then is also a regulatory problem. And we've seen some movement. We've seen the introduction of requirements for sprinklers being extended. We've seen movement on combustible materials and that consultation that's likely to be extended. But what we haven't really yet seen, although we've got good movement on the Building Safety Bill and on this Fire Safety Bill, we haven't seen this comprehensive review of the actual guidance that people work to. So we are essentially working to the same approved documents that we've worked to previously. And I think that's probably the area that is disappointing, because whilst people recognise there is a need for research around some of these issues, we do seem reluctant to get on and commission that research. And as Mr Wrack has said, sometimes reluctant to learn from colleagues in other countries who've also experienced similar problems.
Well, thank you very much to Mr Dobson and Mr Wrack for your excellent evidence. You've helped the committee enormously. As you know, we'll be grappling with these issues this afternoon as we go through the bill line by line. But that concludes this morning's session. Colleagues, order. The